Welcome to this Facebook Live. I have as a guest with me today, Dan Adams. He's the Director of Training at Sources of Strength, which is a youth suicide prevention project that I learned about a few months ago. Dan and I met at an event. We're both on the Faith Task Force of the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which is a public-private partnership whose task is to make a difference in the suicide epidemic in the United States. And Dan and I are part of that Faith Task Force, share a common faith and some common goals around suicide prevention. I was reading just today that more than 5,000 students aged in grades 7 to 12 every single day in the United States attempt suicide. So this is a heartbreaking, shocking statistic, and Dan and I both care very passionately about making a dent in that number. That didn't even include the number of students who actually end up taking their lives. So Dan, just tell us a little bit about yourself as an introduction and you know why the work of suicide prevention matters to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Kay. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you and your audience. Personally, I'm currently the Director of Training for Sources of Strength, and I'm passionate about this work that we get to do with young people. I came probably the long route to this work. It wasn't just an obvious given, but I think draws from my passion of making an impact in young people's lives. And they have so much capacity and human potential and can really walk around a lot of trouble if they have people to walk with and somewhere to walk to. And so my own personal story of what brought me to suicide prevention is, you know, after high school, many years of struggling to find meaning and purpose and getting caught up in drugs and alcohol, and having significant mentors who invited me into generosity and into thinking deeply about the world and expanding my view of spirituality and religion really helps change the trajectory of my life and setting on a course of trying to give back to others. And so I think what we do at Source of Strength is really core to what I know from my own life, that having trusted adults and mentors, having spaces to tap into generosity and spirituality and positive friends around you transform my life. And now that's how I come to suicide prevention, is to be able to do that and spread that across communities and schools to help young people be able to see all the assets and strengths that they have around them, even if they're facing great odds and great adversities. They're not just at risk; they are also, you know, brilliant lights of strength and resilience. And so, helping to uncover that, and then helping communities think about how to spread that and normalize those kinds of behaviors. So, yeah, that's a little bit of my own journey and how I came to this work.
Well, and I think you wove into your own story some of the aims and the goals of Sources of Strength as a program. But just give us just a quick overview for, you know, I had never heard of it before, so I have a feeling a lot of people have not heard of Sources of Strength, and then we'll spend some time really just diving into it, and you can explain it, you know, piece at a time, all the major principles. But just give us like a quick overview of Sources of Strength.
Definitely. So we kind of suitcase words that hold what it is that we do with Source of Strength are that we're a strength-based, and you might say a radically strength-based, what's called upstream suicide prevention program. And in many ways, we're more of a mental health promotion program rather than just prevention. We do prevention. We're also trying to focus on wellness and strength, and how do we create communities of wellness where young people aren't just being caught when they're in crisis and plugged into the right services, but they're learning to live healthy lives full of coping and connection to adults. So we do a lot of activities with peer leaders, empowering peer leaders and groups of adults in middle schools, high schools, universities, community groups, faith-based organizations to carry out activities that juice up or build protective factors into a community that we know are associated with reducing risk around suicidality, and we have an evidence base in that arena. We're now also trying to expand our evidence base to show how these same protective factors can prevent sexual violence, dating violence, bully harassment behaviors, substance use. That when we're healthy human beings, we're able to overcome great adversity. And so those are some of the kind of connection words for what Source of Strength does. We're big on breaking down isolation and codes of secrecy and silence, changing norms around help-seeking behaviors so that young people can tap into help early and often, and really have a norm that's a sign of bravery. It's a sign of courage, not a sign of weakness, to ask for help. And we are completely interdependent individuals, not independent of our communities and of our families, whatnot. So through a lot of that, we focus on, trusted adults. We know that youth that have an adult they could go to for help are 3.5 times less likely to attempt suicide. We focus on school safety because youth who feel safe at school are 3.2 times less likely to attempt suicide. And we know that extracurricular activities, school engagement, these kinds of activities, that youth who participate in them are 1.7 times less likely to attempt suicide. So we help communities really think strategically about how do we juice up those protective factors, strengthen them, and spread them through peer opinion leaders, influencers at a youth level to saturate an entire community with those protective factors. So that's not so short introduction or summary of what we do. Yeah.
But I think, and there's one thing before you might just explain protective factors for somebody who's really not really, it might configure, but just not quite sure exactly what you mean.
Yeah. So, we hear a lot about risk factors. What are those environmental, individual, community, and societal factors that might put someone at risk for suicide? There's, particularly in suicide prevention, a lot of talk around risk and warning signs. And so we know a lot about that here. The protective factor side are what are those things that might help mitigate those risks. So one, I might be an at-risk, so-called at-risk youth, and have a lot of the factors that might put me at higher risk for suicidality, maybe adolescent depression, maybe some kind of mental health diagnosis of bipolar or schizophrenia, or I might be in a population that might be at higher risk, LGBTQ youth that we know are at higher risk for suicidality. But that doesn't doom me to be a statistic, right? And there are a number of protective factors that can exist in my life individually, in my community, and in society in general that can help mitigate or buffer me against the outcome, helping to prevent, the negative impact of those risk factors. And so, particular protective factors might be things like self-esteem, a sense of purpose or meaning, even in the face of the adversities I face. Connectedness to family, to community, to my neighborhood. We know from certain studies, even if my family might be a pretty high risk situation, if I have a caring, trusted adult in my life or in my neighborhood, that can help mitigate the impact of adverse familyhood experiences. We know religiosity or spirituality can often be a protective factor. For some populations, not as much. LGBTQ youth and college students, that's not typically as much of a protective factor, maybe because of the fraught conflict and history of that. We know parental support and bonding with your parents are a protective factor, access to mentors, social supports around you, participation in positive social activities that surround you by a community and help you be healthy and wise of your body and your surroundings. And then, school connectedness and engagement. How safe and connected do you feel to your school? These are all things that protect us. And even, it doesn't mean it wipes out the risk in our lives. Some of those things might lower our risk, but they can help buffer and mitigate the negative outcomes that at a risky environment or situation or lifestyle can have in our lives.
Well, one of the things that was that just captivated me, frankly, when I met you and you were explaining sources of strength to me, you started off by you gave me an example of what sources of strength, how it's different than some other suicide prevention messages or suicide prevention approaches that are taught in schools or communities. And just that one illustration captivated me, and it's the reason that I have you, on this Facebook Live today. It's because I think Sources of Strength represents a completely different approach to suicide prevention. So would you mind just sharing that illustration? I know you know the one I'm talking about, the waterfall, And I really want our audience to hear that. I think it'll give them a great grasp of how Sources of Strength is different.
Yeah. So there's a common parable. It's used a lot in the mental health field. We kind of use it in our own particular way of what upstream prevention really means. So if you can imagine a waterfall, a river that runs through a valley and then over a waterfall. And near the waterfall's edge is a village. And there's a woman who lives in that village who takes a daily walk along the river's edge. And one day she's walking, she hears a shout from the middle of the stream, a young person caught up in the stream about to go over the waterfall. So she dives into action, jumps into the river, swims out, grabs the young person, brings him back to shore, performs CPR, and saves a life. And the whole village celebrates this heroic event. But the next day, as she's walking, she hears another shout from the stream, and another, and another. And they realize there's all these young people caught up in the stream about to go over the waterfall. So they mobilize as they should. They build watchtowers and get the whole village engaged and train lifeguards and life-saving techniques in CPR and in water rescue. And they're able to save a lot of young people. But they're not able to save all of them. And there's just environmental factors. Some come at night and can't be seen. Some are under the surface of the water and they can't be identified. And so burdened by this reality that they keep losing kids, this woman starts to walk upstream, and everybody's like, hey, where are you going? We need all hands on deck. You started this. We can't spare you. And she says, I'm going to move upstream to see if I can't prevent some young people from falling in the river in the first place. Or what the heck's causing all these kids to fall in the river? We got a major issue. We can't just catch them when they're at the waterfall. We got to do better than this. Can we put some fences around the river so less kids fall in? Can we put up some signs that say, hey, watch out, in 10 feet, there's a river. Don't get too close. Can we help kids by having more adults hanging out by the river's edge to reach out a hand when the waters are still relatively calm? Can we have trainings where we teach kids how to cope with when you fall in? Here's how to swim to shore and grab onto the shore and climb out. And so that story really illustrates our vision and mission at Source of Strength, that we need to do better. We need to be doing better in our communities than just catching kids at waterfall moments. That's important work. And it's really most of what we call prevention in the United States is that waterfall model, particularly gatekeeper training people in risk factors and warning signs around suicide, and then plugging kids into the proper mental health referral process. That's important work, and we need to do that better. We strengthen our systems. But we know that that doesn't always work. And we know sometimes there's mental health shortages or gaps, rural areas that have few mental health providers. There's also the experience of, well, I got plugged into mental health services and it didn't help me, or I didn't jive with my counselor, and people get resistant to it. And we can do a lot of work around that. But we really believe we also need to be moving upstream to be talking about how do we strengthen our entire community so less kids fall in the river? How do we train young people to be resilient and normalize the fact that life is actually pretty tough? A lot of tough stuff's going to come our way. We're going to be met with adverse experiences. But in the face of those troubling times, we can become strong and resilient. And we can do that not only as individuals, but as communities and as schools. How do we build protective factors, resilience, raise levels of wellness so that the entire community benefits? And, you know, a couple other things related to that in terms of what Source of Strength's approach, how it's different. I mean, if you think of other arenas of prevention, think, for instance, of heart disease. We have made significant impact on reduction of heart disease death in the United States over the past few decades. And we didn't do that by continually just, training more people in CPR or telling people what to look for when you're having a heart attack, right? That might save someone's moment in crisis, but it doesn't reduce the number of people who get there in the first place. The way we've lowered heart disease death rates is by teaching people how to exercise and how to eat healthy and how to take care of your heart. And this is the shift we really want to see in suicide prevention, is to prevent suicide, we need to teach people how to live and how to take care of their life and their well-being and take care of their spirits and their minds, and to be able to cultivate a life that can buffer the impact of when we face those tough times. We got to do this work ahead of time. We can't just wait till we have a heart attack. And so that's a big piece of it. And as part of that, we're trying to shift a number of things within the field we feel are kind of gaps in terms of limiting our impact, particularly amongst adolescents, but also amongst adult populations. And one is a shift away from just risk towards strength, right? a shift away from just talking about risk. A lot of the field is really always about risk. What are the risks? Targeting the most at-risk populations. And we feel that's important, but when you ask young people what the risk factors are for suicide, they can often list off a pretty thorough list. They might miss a couple of the more difficult ones, but if you ask them, how do you get better? How do you overcome being suicidal? How do you get through it? There's not as much of a conversation, right? There might be a shoulder shrug of, I don't know, see a counselor as the only way. And really, there should be a whole dialogue, a language, a vernacular that we have that we can tap into as communities of how to get better. Because the vast majority of people who've ever been suicidal go on to get better. You know, the statistics can often make us feel like everybody's dying from suicide. But the reality is, if you look at the attempt rate or the ideation rates, and then matched up against the death data, it shows the vast majority of people get better. They don't die by suicide. They fight a tough fight, and some don't win that fight, but the vast majority do get better. And so we need to have a conversation where we're spreading that. Well, what did they use? So I don't feel so alone and isolated when it happens to me, but I know that the norm is people find ways to survive and to thrive. The other thing is, I think this is a shift away from like a deficit model towards an asset-based model. Young people in particular are not just a deficit or a problem to be solved, but they have assets and strengths in their own lives and in their community that they can become agents of change, of health, and wellness in their own lives. It's not just us as adults trying to solve them as problems, right? We can help them uncover their own assets. Another part of that is to shift away just from individuals. This is a population level issue, and just like any other public health issue, we can make an impact by trying to strengthen whole populations. And a big part of that, I saw that you all ran a Facebook Live recently discussing 13 reasons why. A big part of that population level is that we as Americans in general really gravitate towards sad, shocking, and traumatic stories. Yes. That can often shift the narrative to the trauma. And as you had mentioned in that live video, it can reinforce that for some kids, that's what high school feels like. And they could say, this is what high school's like, that's why we like the video. But the reality is it's only like that on some days. Yeah. And on most days, it's not like that. And on most days, somebody taps into hope or finds help or uses strengths, or their counselor notices that something's going on, or their parent gets engaged. And so our organization is really about shifting the conversation and narrative away from sad, shock, trauma to hope, strength. And in suicide prevention, you know, as you're aware, a lot of times we start off with the death data that can be really shocking, and we might use that if we're trying to convince policymakers that this really matters. But when we're talking to kids or community, it can create a sense of despair rather than talking about what is hope? How do we tap into hope?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I have so many thoughts, but because Matthew was suicidal, my son Matthew was suicidal from the first I heard of it, he was 12. That was the first time he talked about wanting to die and just not wanting to live, and began a search, you know, over the next decade, really, about just the ambivalence he felt about living and dying. And so I have to say, through those years, I don't know that I was particularly adept at knowing even how to talk about it, because to me and to my husband, it just felt like a desperate race every day to keep him alive. And it really did get to that place in the last couple of years. We lived with that knowledge that truly any certain day, any day could be the day that he couldn't fight any longer. And so I think when you live in that crisis mode for a long time, you just sort of get into that, your world becomes very narrow and you're just focusing on keeping him alive. Whether, you know, as a 12-year-old, if he brushed his teeth or picked up his underwear off the floor, didn't matter nearly as much to us as keeping him alive, helping him through depression. And I say all that to say that, so by the time that Matthew died, I knew our story really well, but I didn't know how to help somebody else. I didn't know how to talk to another student. I didn't know what would be the way to approach it. And so I think as I just began that work of suicide prevention, being an advocate for people living with mental illness and with chronic suicidality, all I knew to do was go to the shock, the sad, the trauma. That's all I knew. And so as I even advocated for people to do suicide prevention trainings and talk to students and talk to youth about it in particular, where those numbers were rising and were so personal to me. And so when I met you in a few months ago, and you shared that waterfall story, and that I almost had to just sit down. First of all, I still feel that sense of just wanting to kind of put my head on the desk and cry, because I'm not sure that we've been doing it right. I'm not sure that we've done all that we can do. We're doing a lot right there at the waterfall level. And yet there are so many other students, so many other kids who don't know how to get through what they're going through. Even if they don't attempt suicide, and they're living at such a painful level of despair and don't know how to cope with their lives. And so when you shared that waterfall and moving upstream just captivated me. We could really do this better. We might really be able to make a significant difference in the lives of students. And then just because I have some those age group folks in my family, and hearing as they came home and talked about the suicide prevention messages they got just this spring in health class, and how triggering it was, and how terrifying it was, and how students were using the word suicide almost in a joking way, like, yeah, I'll just go kill myself, So if the intent has been to normalize conversations about suicide and to make it a topic that we can actually approach, I think maybe what we've done is we've taken it from normalize in the sense of it's not a taboo topic per se, but I don't know that we're actually helping them if they turn it into kind of a joke, or it's a terrifying thing that if they have even one depressed thought, then it's immediate, like, oh my gosh, what if I start to feel like I'm going to kill myself, and they don't have what Sources of Strength is approach is. You know what? You are stronger than you think you are, and you do have sources of strength to call upon. So why don't you, Dan, tell us a little bit about, I want you to come back in a minute maybe and talk about, how it spreads through social networks, or which is really important, in the peer-led. But, well, actually, you can tell me, would you like to just dive into the wheel a little bit, those sources of strength, or do you want to actually set that up? You tell me.
I can do that now, but I also want to respond to what you just said. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and sharing your story. And we would never want the philosophy of Sources of Strength to invalidate the pain and the struggle that you went through in every day fighting for life with your son. Your story is valuable. His life was, and I don't think it's so much of trying to say, hey, we want to hide that. We want to really be matter of fact about that. That's tough. And every time I've heard you share your son's story and your and Rick's story with me, it has been, what were the things that were helping you get through it on a regular basis? Yeah. What were the things in your family and your spouse and in your community and your faith that really helped you hold on? And it doesn't mean that a different approach, we're going to be able to save every life. But when you do say, let's take it to the population level rather than individual, we hear a lot of suicide prevention can be well-intentioned and yet leave the most vulnerable of our student population walking away feeling triggered, like, particularly individuals like yours, your family, who have lost a family member to suicide. Hearing about it in a sad, shocking way can bring up those emotions again, and not lead towards recovery of like, okay, well, what do I do with these feelings? So just to say, hey, yeah, a lot of us have been impacted by this. Suicidality is not uncommon. People have felt that way. We may have lost people to it. But here's what we know, both from research and from stories that we hear over and over again of what's helping. And so that leads right into, as you say, the wheel of strength. That's kind of the core of what we do at Sources of Strength. That has 8 strengths. And so it includes family support, positive friends, mentors, healthy activities, generosity, spirituality, and medical access and mental health. And these are 8 things that we both know have, come from the research and evidence around what we know to be protective and reducing risk around suicide, amongst other issues young people face. And we've also heard from just hundreds of thousands of young people across the country, as well as adults in communities and schools, of ways in which these strengths have been protective for them, that have helped me get through, and a whole myriad, a whole continuum of life situations, right? These strengths can help a student who's maybe not suicidal, but struggling to get into the college of their choice and manage conflict at home. That student's going to benefit, or relationship breakup, they're going to benefit from having coping around these strengths. The same as a student, who might be feeling suicidal, who might be at risk for suicide or maybe bullying, harassment, and they're going to be able to tap into these strengths in ways that can help them manage and cope with what's going on, and also to recover, get better, and then think preventatively. And so the core of Source of Strength is really this wheel. At its core, I feel it's a storytelling program to how we shift both our community and our school narrative about ourselves, but also our personal narratives. That who am I and what is the story I tell about myself? And if we can really uncover what's already there, not telling kids to do anything different, but what are the assets and strengths I have around me, and begin to tell their story. So it might look like, I have been suicidal this past year, and that's been tough. And sometimes, the world gets dark and my vision gets narrow, but my family has really been there to support me. And they show up on a regular basis to really love and care for me. And my positive friends understand what I'm going through, and they show up in ways I don't even have to ask. And I have mentors, and my faith has been really strong, tapping into that. And I've been volunteering this year, and it's really helped kind of snap me out of some of that. And even if it doesn't go away, they're able to tell their story through the strength lens of what's helping me. And over time, hopefully that becomes internalized. I might start by telling that story in the past, or kind of leading up to now, and then it becomes part of who I am. I integrate it seamlessly within my self-narrative that I am strong. I am resilient in the face of great odds. And as opposed to we use the language of at-risk youth, and people can start to tell their story of I'm just an outsider, or I'm at risk, or I'm a troublemaker, and that becomes the story that they live into. And so Source of Strength is really about shifting individual, community, and societal narratives that we can tell it through this lens of strength. And it's not anything new. Mark Lowery, our founder and director, as he was developing this wheel, was really interacting with a lot of theories around resilience and 40 developmental assets that were out at the time. We know, and it's based on that good work, but Mark, I think, his genius in developing this wheel was, how do we operationalize those assets in a way that people can tell their story really simply? Who's going to remember 40 assets? Unless you have it right there in front of you. But this wheel is a really simple way to prompt people, to easily say, hey, when you were going through that tough time, looking at this wheel, what has been helping you? What's given you the capacity to get through? What are the strengths you're using? And then it also leads towards agency of, I can strengthen some of these, right? I can get stronger. Family support, some of us come from great families, and others might feel like not my family. My family is the most traumatic part of my life. So we might have to help them think, well, who's the healthiest member of your extended family? An auntie or an uncle or grandma or grandpa, or maybe it's your chosen family. Maybe it's your best friend's parents, who, when stuff's tough at home, you go hide out at their house, and they're helping you get through it. They show up to your school and help you with parent stuff, right? So giving students a capacity to say, I can grow these. I might not be strong in mentors right now, but that's one I want to strengthen. So maybe I'm going to keep an eye out for a teacher or a counselor or a youth leader or a pastor who I really look up to, I'm going to ask them if I could see them occasionally and spend some time and bounce ideas off of them, and I can grow these. Or, looking at this wheel, I think it gives people a lot of agency, not only to tell their story, but then in real life, we start to learn to put it into action. So even I've been working for Source of Strength for 4 years. This wheel is a daily part of my life, that when adversity hits, as it does, tough stuff happens. I lost my brother-in-law to a heart attack last year in South Africa, and it just rocked our whole family, my wife's family. And in the face of that, we get the chance to develop resilience. Doesn't mean the sadness or the pain's going to go away. That Stuart, my brother-in-law's, we're going to miss him for the rest of our lives. But we can tap into each other and the strengths around us to help us get it, so that the adversity of that experience doesn't snowball into more serious crisis. Yeah. So
that is brilliant. I mean, truly, I just think it's brilliant. It's kind of like one of those, well, duh, kind of things when you really think about it. It's like, well, of course, that's where we need to spend a lot of time and focus on suicide prevention. So how does it work? Give us maybe a pretty brief overview of how Sources of Strength actually, what's the approach in a school? For instance, use a school as an example.
Yeah, so I'll give an example of the basic school model. The model is bringing together a group of adult advisors that act as a kind of advisory team, give access to the school. The characteristics around those adults we're looking for, they could be any kind of position: admin, counselors, teachers, resource officers, transportation, food service, concerned parents, youth leaders. But we're looking for caring, connected, and positive adults who believe in kids. They're connected to them, but they also have the capacity to be positive. When you're working with young people, there can be some false starts and lack of follow through. You have to really believe change is possible, and that the voice that these young people have has the capacity to make an impact. And so to create the right platform, we need adults that give students access into school, empower them, and say, hey, you can do this work better than we can as adults. There's just something about that. You know what your peers are going through. You know much sooner than I do as an adult. And you also have the capacity to speak hope into your friends' lives in a way that I don't as adults. But we need adults to partner with young people to support them. And then a group of diverse peer leaders. So diversity in terms of race and religion and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation. Yes, that kind of diversity, but also different social cliques, categories, groups, tribes of young people. We need some of your typical leadership students, but also some of your edgier students that don't typically get tapped for leadership style programs, but they have influence within their peer networks, and they can speak the same language as their peers that another student might not. So we look for a big swath of diversity across the social network. We do trainings for both, one for adults, 3 to 6 hours, and then a 4 to 6 hour training for peer leaders together with the adults. And then they, out of that training, come out into a series of strategic messaging campaigns that get at these 8 strengths and breaking down codes of silence and building connection and changing help-seeking behaviors and norms around help-seeking, perceptions of help-seeking. And so they do a lot of activities that usually don't look like your typical prevention strategy, right? They look like celebrating life, talking about these strengths. They look like playing a lot of fun games and connecting to people in your school and your friends. And that's really one of the things I love about Source of Strength is most of the time we're not talking about suicide. We're talking about what's the good stuff in life that helps us get through the tough days and the good days. And we're celebrating that. And all of that is happening. Some of it looks like messaging campaigns. It could be like a public health approach that are more than just like posters or PSAs. They might include that, but they're designed to be interactive, engaging, and invite people to apply strength to their life. So rather than just awareness about something, we want to really trick people into practicing this so that without even knowing it, they're developing resilience and strength. So the peer leaders think strategically about how to do that, but in its entirety, it's really designed to change climate and culture, be an environmental strategy to shift culture over time of a school. And we do that just to end on through the methodology of positive social norming. And if any of the listeners are not familiar with that, a lot of prevention is actually negative social norming. So we tell you about the behavior we don't want you to engage in. And so if I said, 18% of high school seniors smoke cigarettes, what your brain does is you think, oh, that's a lot more than I thought. That's a lot of kids, 18%. But it doesn't tell you anything about the 82% that don't. And why don't they get more attention? Why aren't we reinforcing their behaviors and norms and talking and telling stories about those kids? And so we unintentionally, through a lot of prevention efforts, it reinforce a negative or even false norm in our brains that we think, the tons of people are dying by suicide or everybody's feeling suicidal, rather than shifting it to help give strategies towards the positive pro-social norms and behaviors. And this methodology has been used in substance use prevention and a whole bunch of other strategies. But it's relatively new through social strength in the suicide prevention sphere. There's others that are picking up on it, but it's really key to what we do of how do we not reinforce how pervasive suicide is, because it's actually quite rare, even though it's more common than we would like it to be. How do we reinforce how people get through it and tell the stories of the positive pro-social behaviors, and then we can see that spread across a community. And so that might be the social networking.
That social network. We have a graphic for that too, because when you were explaining, to me the first time how Sources of Strength works, you were talking about those diverse student leaders and how they have their pocket of influence in a school. So explain this little diagram here.
Yeah, so this might be, this is just a mock-up. We have some others of an actual social network, but this is like a hypothetical of how we live and are interacting with each other. So not just our online social networks, but who the people we are connected to. And it's in any given school, I have my friends who have friends of friends, and we're connected in many different ways. So every dot might represent a student, every line a relationship. And we know that disease or illness spread through a network, right? So, we're all online right now, so you're safe if I had a flu or cold. But when I go to school, I'm going to show up. Other kids are going to get it. They take it home to their families. The teacher takes it to home. You expose other people to that illness. This quite well. I think through your work in Africa in HIV/AIDS prevention, right? That we know the disease spread across the continent of Africa in very particular ways. We had truck drivers driving up the North African highway spreading HIV/AIDS all along the way, right? So we have illnesses that can spread and disease. We're now learning, and we've studied that through the CDC for many years, we're now learning that behaviors and norms spread through networks in the same way. So things like smoking behavior. If I'm a smoker, not only do I put my immediate friends at higher risk of being a smoker, we kind of assume that. Your parents are always telling you, don't hang out with the bad kids because you'll be influenced. But their friends are at higher risk. So people I don't even know, a friend of a friend is at higher risk because of my behavior. And a friend of a friend of a friend, even a third degree of separation, statistically speaking, we see more common smoking behaviors. And only to the fourth degree of separation does my behavior no longer impact my network. And so I think that really confounds our rugged individualistic mentality as Americans, that I make all my decisions for myself, apart or free from other people, when in reality, we're impacted by our networks in pretty profound ways. The positive part is we also have the capacity to impact our network, both in negative and in positive ways. And so Source of Strength turned this social network theory analysis of what we're learning from that. We use it both in terms of researching our program, but also in operationalizing what we do in the program. And so we view young people, once trained, as these patient zero of epidemic of health or a contagion of strength, that they can go out and infect their social network with positive norms and behaviors, and that hope can be contagious, that it can spread through a community, lifting people's spirits. And even in the darkest of times, when faced with loss or with adversity or with trauma or war, we see communities rise up with resilience in the face of really difficult times, and we can see it spread. And so we're really excited about, how do we help communities do that ahead of time or in the face of that, to spread positive norms and behaviors that can help prevent the onset of those crises. So really selecting peer leaders from across the social network of school, that's why that diversity matters, so that we can impact that. And the other thing that this kind of hypothetical network we have up doesn't show as much. The yellow dots would be illustrating suicidal ideation, red dots, suicide attempts in the past 12 months. That often we see a clustering together when we do this kinds of network analysis. A clustering together of students with suicide attempts or ideation are often together in friendship groups that have other peers that have experienced suicidal ideation. So there, or attempts, so that there's a little bit of a suicide homophily, like it's either birds of a feather flock together, that kind of all the depressed kids or who are feeling suicidal kind of grouped together, or it could be a potential kind of contagion thing, that there's some dissemination of norms and behaviors across a network. And so we need students that can speak to that group, right? And often school engagement initiatives kind of recruit from all your typical leadership students. And so we need a diversity. But I also find it really helpful to really work with communities and instill this sense of hope that we can make a change. We can, the way things currently are, the way we're impacted by these major issues, they're just symptoms of deeper issues. And we can change the environment and the context around those deeper issues to hopefully downstream see less occurrences of suicidality and suicide attempts. And so that's really Sources of Strength's vision, and how we're mobilizing and trying to inspire schools and communities and faith groups that change is possible. We can impact our network, and hope can really be contagious. Yeah.
I love it. If you want to check out Sources of Strength, you go to sourcesofstrength.org. If you have any voice at all in your child's school, and if you don't, this is your moment maybe to speak up to promote Sources of Strength. Here in California, we have been mandated by California law that suicide prevention training has to be in all the middle schools and high schools, but the particular method is not. The particular program is not mandated. So if you're watching this and you think, I want my child to be in a school that uses something like Sources of Strength, where you're teaching resilience, where there's hope. It's a hope-based approach. I love the idea of infecting hope and spreading hope. So you can, as a parent, you can talk to your particular school and encourage the Board of Education in your area to consider Sources of Strength as a program. If you're a youth group in a church or a faith-based, mosque or a synagogue somewhere else, you can again contact. I know that they're interested in helping youth groups also employ this as a suicide prevention method. Resilience. It's really teaching resilience with the end goal of preventing more and more students from even feeling suicidal. And I love that. I love that as a goal. I love your dream and intention to spread hope. Again, that's sourcesofstrength.org. And Dan, thank you so much for your time. You've said such great words there at the end. Is there anything else that, I know you have a new baby and you look rested. You don't look sleep deprived. You look like you're getting some sleep, but congratulations on that new little addition to your family. And anything else you would want to say or speak to a parent or an adult, a caring adult, just one more word about how important they are.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough about how important trusted adults are. The adults in young people's lives. We got lots of great adults out there giving their lives away to young people on a regular basis in schools, in communities, in faith organizations, and churches, and mosques, and synagogues, places of worship. And can't say enough to just say, keep giving your lives away to young people. They need it. It sometimes goes unthanked. But it transforms people's lives like it transforms my life as a youngster. And then I wouldn't be sitting here having a conversation with you if it hadn't been for the mentors and the youth leaders and the guides that helped me uncover the strength and the potential I had. So I think that's really key. And why I love this work is the absence of mental illness isn't mental health. It's got to be more than that, right? We got to do more to actually get at what health looks like. And so encouraging people out there to tell your story of strength and resilience, because it impacts the people around you. And as Brene Brown might say, every time you have the courage and bravery to be vulnerable, to share your story of strength and resilience, you give permission to other people around you to also be brave and to be strong. And we can really make a dent in the diversity and the stuff that we see in the United States by really showing up in our lives and using the untapped reservoirs of hope that we have around us. So just want to encourage everybody out there who's listening to be present to the people in your life, particularly young people around us, and have faith and hope that we can make a change on a daily basis. So keep doing that great work that you're doing, and reach out to Source of Strength if you like anything we said. And thank you, Kay, for taking the time and inviting me to have this conversation with you. And I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Dan. Hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.